The Zimbabweans are saying our problems are Zimbabwean and we'll solve them like Zimbabweans. Call us racist all you want, but we are simply saying that there were historical wrongs which were perpetrated against us, which are recorded in history, and we are going to do so and to correct them despite your protestation to the contrary. You have punished us through sanctions because, in a manner of speaking, they are saying you are essentially thieves who don't want to admit that you are thieves. The entire movement in the world, in the black world now, that is talking about reparations is about the colonialists, the British and the Dutch and the Italians and the French being required to admit we were wrong, we should not have enslaved you. We are wrong, we should not have colonized you. We are wrong because we treated you like subhuman beings. You know, as a law student who was being taught law, I remember my professor of land law, we used to call it land law then we now call it the law of property in land, used to tell us that the last colonial question is the land question. And if you look throughout the history of the struggle for independence in Africa, it was about land. And I had the advantage of listening to the interview that was subjecting the president of Zimbabwe, President Mnangagwa, to certain very irritating questions, if you may. And it is very easy to simplify the question. But this must be understood in the context of colonial conquest. And it's important to point out at the very outset that the international community at a certain stage, and much more prominently in 1945, when the United Nations came into being in San Francisco, did declare that colonization and colonies were anti-humanity. And if one understands it in that context, one must understand the land question in that very context. If you look at different experiences, particularly when the European powers sat in Berlin in 1884, 1885, and partitioned Africa into spheres of influence, and the countries which gained their independence gained it on the basis of those imposed boundaries, then you see the land question. And if we were to start, say, from South Africa or Southern Africa, when the Dutch came in 1688 or thereabouts in the 17th century, that was a period when Jan van Riebeeck and his people came there, and they took the land, they seized the land from the indigents of that land. And the British, very specifically in Australia in 1788, in taking the Australian land, said, this is terra nullius. In other words, this land belongs to nobody. But there were people there. Therefore, the first thing that the colonials did was to seize land by declaring that the people who were there did not own the land. If it was in what we now know as Zimbabwe, for example, there were communities there. And to track relevant history, in 1889, a British agent known as Cecil Rhodes formed a company called the British South African Company. And in 1890, his group invaded what was then known as, what they named Rhodesia. And when they invaded, the pioneer force or the pioneer group was the one that he led. He then landed in what was then known as Mashonaland, and in 1890 established what was then, or what they called, Salisbury. And you remember Salisbury was then the Prime Minister of Britain or the United Kingdom. And from that day on, they continued their conquest. From 1990, they continued, and in 1893, invaded the kingdom of Matabele, the Matabele land, and drove away their king, King Lobengula, and established what we now know as Bulawayo. That is when the whole exercise of expropriation of land started. The queen at that time was Queen Victoria. And the whole idea was to seize land for the settlers. And this entailed, among other things, that the indigents in what we now know as Zimbabwe from the 1980s was peopled preponderantly by the people known as the Shona and the Ndebele. Their land was seized and taken by the white settlers. In fact, most of the arable land. In 1930, they enacted what is known as the Land Apportionment Act. And under the Land Apportionment Act, the whites, who did not number more than 47,000 at that time, the total population of Zimbabwe during that period was no more than 6 million, were given 50% of the most arable land, and the natives, as the Africans were called at that particular time, were given 30% of land, not necessarily arable. And that is what continued with the blacks being treated as second-class citizens, almost subhuman. So when you talk about land, we must look at it from the perspective of theft. It was theft because might was right. The British had the firepower. They subdued the Africans. After subduing them, they took their most prized possession, because in those days, agriculture was the backbone and land was the major factor of production. So you took a person's land, then you took his or her very being. That is the context in which Cecil Rhodes and his band of thieves, if you may, seized land from the Zimbabweans, even had the audacity to name the country Rhodesia, after Cecil Rhodes himself. So all these continued, and progressively all the arable land was seized by these individuals from the United Kingdom, and Africans were put in the periphery, and the administrations then ran the country as if it was their own, and the blacks were subjects. They then introduced systems of registration. And it is not lost on me that quite a number of the systems of land registration that were introduced in Zimbabwe and other colonies had already been tried and tested in Australia. The Torrens system, they had absolute ownership, they had leaseholds, leases of 999 years, and the blacks retained communal land because the concept of ownership of land in most African communities was communal. So this is the historical context in which this must be understood. So when the blacks have been treated in the manner that they were, from the 1930s, particularly much more in the 1940s, not only in modern-day Zimbabwe, but everywhere in Africa, people were fighting to regain our land. They either called it their motherland or their fatherland, but they wanted to take charge of their land. The entire struggle for independence was about land. So 1930s, we go on and the struggles begin, and ultimately in 1960s, when the process of decolonization starts in different parts of the world and Africa, the whites in Zimbabwe, or then Rhodesia, never intended to leave. Zimbabwe was a settler community. And that is why when the process of decolonization was taking place in other contiguous nations such as Nyasaland, now Malawi, or Northern Rhodesia, now Zambia, The whites in Rhodesia in 1965, under Ian Smith, declared what is called the Unilateral Declaration of Independence. And they said, we are now independent from the United Kingdom. We don't think that majority rule should be allowed. We don't think that the blacks are ready and prepared to govern themselves. We are therefore going to run this country called Rhodesia. That is Ian Smith. Contemporaneously prior to that, in 1948, Hendrik Verwoerd, under his party, had also declared the apartheid regime as the dominant regime in Southern Africa, where racism was institutionalized under apartheid. But let us go back to Zimbabwe. What has Smith done? UDI, sanctions against Zimbabwe, or rather against Rhodesia then, by the British, by the UN, and everybody else, and then it sparks the War of Independence. And you see great Zimbabwean sons arising at that time. Joshua Nkomo, Ndambaningi Sithole, Robert Gabriel Mugabe, and others. And even the current president was part of the group that was in the struggle in those early days, Emmerson, Ndambuzo, Mnangagwa. And ultimately, in 1980, independence is regained in the month of April. But prior to that, the British colonialists now recognize that land is an important question. It cannot be ignored. And there is a meeting in Lancaster, which I think was a very good-natured meeting where the blacks gave major concessions. They said, we are going to acquire land as the independent government of Zimbabwe, and we are going to compensate the white landowners. You, the British, because you committed the original sin, you are going to finance this process of acquisition of land. The British reneged on that promise. The process of willing buyer, willing seller did not take place as it was contemplated. The whites were not willing to leave, they were not willing to sell, and the British were not bringing in the money. So in the 1990s, you see there is a problem already. What then happens? In the year 2000, the administration of Robert Gabriel Mugabe says, we are going to seize land, and this time round without compensation. And the land seizures then begin in earnest. They are very indiscriminate. People get large parcels of land. The political class get large parcels of land. And the entire land question then remains a problem in Zimbabwe up to the time that we speak as the last colonial question. What then happened, of course, is that people seized land without expertise in agriculture, and we also know that Zimbabwe was then subjected to sanctions so that it became problematic for the new black farmers, even when they were working in collaboration with their white counterparts, to produce at the levels at which the white farmers were producing in those early days. But that does not take away the fact that land was seized. I think the president of Tanzania, the late Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere, being asked the same question in the 1980s, said, we do not condemn the whites in Zimbabwe because they are white. We condemn them because they are inhumane and unreasonable. They want to sustain a governance system which cannot be sustained. They cannot stop majority rule. If they believe in democracy, then the reality is there are more blacks in Rhodesia or in Zimbabwe, and when they are called upon to vote, they'll vote overwhelmingly for their black people. But if they are good whites who have accepted that they are now Zimbabweans and want to live as Zimbabweans without thinking that they are superior, then they'll be accommodated. And he gave this analogy. He said, This argument that we hear from the white Zimbabweans or the British government that you cannot seize land is without merit. He said, you came, and this is the analogy that he gave. You came, you stole my coat, and several years down the line, once I've seized my coat back, you say, the coat is no longer yours because it doesn't fit you well. And he said, it is still my coat. And this is what the blacks are saying, that the land was ours in the first place. But we are so gracious that we now recognize that you successive generations did not commit the original sin. If therefore you accept that you are willing to live in Zimbabwe and be part of Zimbabwe and be part of the Zimbabwean culture, then you will own land like any other Zimbabwean, and in such proportion that does not disentitle and disempower the others. And that is the question that some of the whites who are still racist. And what is racism? Racism is the belief by certain individuals that by dint of their color, they are inferior to others and that others are their subordinates whose only place in life is to be drawers of water and hewers of wood for them. And that is the position in which we should understand the mother question, that land is the last colonial question. And until you deal with the issue of land in Zimbabwe and indeed in South Africa and indeed in different parts of the world and Africa, people will always fight for their land, their birthright. You know, I've heard the interview that was conducted by Tucker Carlson and asking the president of Zimbabwe questions that he thought were searching and almost traps. But to his credit, President Mnangagwa acquitted himself very effectively. Because the gist of the question was, if the Rhodesian whites were racists in occupying large tracts of land, are you not being racist now that you are seizing land? And I believe that Mnangagwa answered very effectively. Number one, land did not belong to any race. And the very reason why Zimbabweans fought against Smith and the British was to restore order and to ensure that the injustices that were committed during classical colonization and during the Smith administration was corrected. And what was the issue? The British came in 1890, found Zimbabweans in Mashonaland and in Matabeleland. They treated them as if they were subhuman, seized their land, created something called citizenship. When Zimbabwe regained her independence, some of them chose to be Zimbabweans. After that, everybody recognized that there were historical injustices which ought to be dealt with. There was a meeting in Lancaster that said, yes, we are going to ensure that there is fair redistribution so that people have land that they can till. That did not happen. It became necessary to seize land between 2000 and 2002 and beyond. And it is also true that those who seized land initially in 1890 are long dead, but it is also true that their children and children's children, the bulk of them still are hanging and are laboring under superiority, hangover of superiority complex, and they want to be in Zimbabwe, but they want to live in a bubble where they run their own world. They want blacks in Zimbabwe to continue to be treated as if they were subhuman. Correcting a historical wrong cannot be characterized as racism. And what is important is, number one, to acknowledge that there was a historical problem. That problem started in Berlin in 1884. A people came from their land, from the Netherlands, from the island that is called the British Island, and they came to another people's land, and they seized it, and they now say, no, If you are taking your land back, then you are wrong, you are racist. That cannot be true. And remember that this is the kind of argument that the British have put forth everywhere they have colonized. They put it forth with the Chinese as regards Hong Kong. They did so in India. And in India in 1947, Gandhi told them straight on at a conference in London, our problems are Indian problems. We will solve them like Indians. We will have our problems, but they will be our solution. The Zimbabweans are saying our problems are Zimbabwean, and we'll solve them like Zimbabweans. Call us racist all you want, but we are simply saying that there were historical wrongs which were perpetrated against us, which are recorded in history, and we are going to do so and to correct them despite your protestation to the contrary. You have punished us through sanctions because, in a manner of speaking, they are saying you are essentially thieves who don't want to admit that you are thieves. The entire movement in the world, in the black world now, that is talking about reparations is about the colonialists, the British and the Dutch and the Italians and the French being required to admit we were wrong, we should not have enslaved you. We are wrong, we should not have colonized you. We are wrong because we treated you like subhuman beings. We are wrong, and therefore what we want to do is to compensate you, not because the money will solve all our problems. They are psychological scars, but this is our token of requiring forgiveness from you. But the tragedy is that Western media particularly, and popular media in the West, and those who are still prefects of colonialism and neo-colonialism want to create the impression that the victim is actually the wrongdoer. That cannot and must not be allowed, and indeed it will not be allowed. And one must applaud President Mnangagwa in standing his ground and telling the world, you made a mistake. You, the British, we are going to take back our land because it is our birthright. The white Zimbabweans who are the children of those who committed the original sin may have atoned for their own grandfathers and grandmothers' mistakes if they now come and say, yes, color does not matter. We are all of the human race. We are Zimbabweans. We are going to live with you. We are going to earn our keep. We are going to respect you. And in that way, we build a greater Zimbabwe. Then that is good. And there are many whites in Zimbabwe who are living as we speak and who have accepted to be Zimbabweans. But those who are suffering from colonial hangover will suffer. South Africa presents a very unique scenario. Unique in the sense that this is one of the few societies in the world where a group of whites in 1948, led by Hendrik Verwoerd, institutionalized racism and characterized people according to their skin color, and it became a legal thing to be racist. The international community declared apartheid to be a crime against humanity. It was decimated in 1994, and all residents of South Africa, we are told, we are now South Africans, we are now a rainbow nation with blacks and whites and everybody else. That is the theory of it. But underneath, there are people who still believe that they are superior. They are slave masters who cannot even begin to imagine that the former slaves have left and want to be treated as equals. And you can see that there is resistance. That is how you see the creation of white-only enclaves such as Orania. That is why you see in the rhetoric of some of the whites, they actually want to create a white state. And they want the Western Cape and the Orange State and those others to be the fulcrum so that they have their white-only state. But they are whites. They are persons of Asian origin who long liberated themselves from this belief. And historically, you'll find that there were whites who are involved in the struggle against apartheid. People like Ruth First, people like Ahmed Kathrada, who are not of African origin, but Mark Maharaj. These were individuals who believed, as Robert Sobukwe once said, that there is only one race, the human race. So today when you hear people complaining about what they call reverse racism, is because they are being denied the opportunity to be slave masters again, and they cannot believe it. They are the ones who are attracted by this suggestion that they can go to the United States and liberate themselves. And no sooner do they arrive in the United States than they recognize that life is much better in South Africa and they come back. There is no reverse racism. What the South Africans want to reverse is the inequality. And South Africa is the home of inequality. If you go and see the kind of land that is still controlled by whites in that part of the world, particularly in the Western Cape, you will be shocked. So the whole idea of reparation, the whole idea of bringing equality, and the whole idea of the movement of having land redistribution is to correct the past, the injustices of the past. And peace can only be sustainable where there is no injustice. You cannot have a small percentage of the population owning more than half of the arable land, and you expect the disenfranchised persons of African origin to remain silent. Of course, they will make many claims that this is racism, but they know in their heart of hearts that what is being done is to repair the damage that was occasioned for nearly 300 years. And that effort is going to continue. There'll be protests, there'll be accusations and counter-accusations, but my own view is the sooner that these remnants of apartheid, these remnants of racism recognize that sustainable peace and justice not only requires but demands that justice be done to all, then only and only then will they find peace, the inner peace that they need. All these ideas of changing the narrative will not take them very far, because justice will be done. It may be painful, but the pain can be avoided through negotiation. And I think this is what the successive administrations in Zimbabwe, in South Africa, have tried to do, despite the pushback from the remnants of white racism. You know, whenever the question of racism is brought forth in circumstances where historical injustices are being righted, if you may, those who bring forth that argument normally try to say, you are going too deep into history. That is not our history. We are different. But they say with their mouths what they do not do and do not believe in their hearts, because we judge them by their conduct, not by their history. And the question put very plainly is this: if your grandfathers gave you land of 1,000 acres and took it from me, and as I'm talking to you, I only have 1 acre, and I'm saying out of your 1,000 acres, remain with 100. Allow 900 to be distributed to your black brothers and sisters. And you say, no, this land, I inherited it. This one I'm not going to give you. Just remain nice. We are friends. In your condition with your 1 acre, feel happy. And let me feel happy with my 1,000 acres. But I'm not like my grandfather. Surely, you are like your grandfather. You are trying to keep what you do not own. If you are different from your grandfather, you would say, my grandfather was very unfair. It cannot be right that have 1,000 acres, and 1,000 of my brothers and sisters who are black don't have any, or if they do, they only have 1 acre each, and is in the worst, most difficult parts with stones and pebbles. So they are being convicted by their own conduct. They say with their mouths what they do not believe in their hearts, and the evidence that is available confirms that they perhaps are much worse than their grandfathers, particularly being as enlightened as they should be or ought to be in the context of what the world is now talking about, in the face of declared human rights, in the face of declared positions which are known to the world and all and sundry. So this accusation, where the slave master's son tells the sons of the former slaves, we are now all equal, but I can continue to live in the mansion while you continue to live in the shack, and we say hallelujah, both of us, is a position, in my view, that is untenable. But the tragedy is that sometimes people get so used to being unjust to others that even when they are told, even when justice sits on their laps and shouts at the top of its voice saying, I am justice, you are unjust, they have become deaf. They cannot hear. It is therefore our duty to remove the wax from their ears and to remove the scales from their eyes that they can see. And sometimes how do you do it? By taking away what they have and distributing it so that justice is done. Because justice also aids the vigilant. And that is what is being done in South Africa, that is being done in Zimbabwe, and that is how it will be done. I remember one famous saying, and I want to be understood in context. It is the German Otto von Bismarck who once said, I think it is in 1862, that the issues of that day will not be solved by speeches and resolutions, but by iron and blood. In a totally different context, I'm saying that the position of land and restoration of justice in Zimbabwe and South Africa will not be solved by declarations and speeches. It will be solved by action. And that action means that there will be laws which are enacted, which will be implemented, which will cause pain to some people. Sometimes justice is the child of pain. There is a beautiful saying in Kiswahili, mjinga akierevuka mwerevu yu mashakani. That when one who was thought to be a fool becomes wise, one who thought he was wise gets worried. And I think that is what is happening. Different communities in different parts of the world have now woken up to the reality that they have been abused, they have been suppressed for too long. And those who are classical racists who still want to remain racist, are now feeling threatened. And in order to ensure that their positions are reserved, they are now calling those who are waking up racists. Do we remember the age-old English saying, if you want to kill a dog, you give it a bad name? They are now seeing this dog, metaphorically speaking, which has woken up, and they want to kill it by giving it a bad name. That will not work. It can appear to work. You can use the media all you want. You can change the narrative all you want. You can embellish things all you want. You can try to change history all you want. But history has this uncanny habit of always rising up. That old aphorism or cliche which says that lies often take the elevator and the truth takes the stairs is true. Ultimately, the truth will emerge because all these accusations are without merit. How can it be that people have churches and empires have apologized for slavery? churches and peoples and empires have apologized about colonization. And yet we don't want to condemn the child or the children of colonization, which is neo-colonization. And that is why we normally argue, at least some of us argue, that the last question, in addition to land, is economic liberation. We may have sought and obtained political liberation, but the economic liberation is the final leg of it. Because without economic liberation, it means that the crown is without the jewels. And it is economic liberation that is going to ensure that people have and control means and factors of production. In this world of intelligence, land still remains an important aspect of it. And of course, opportunities and other things, including minerals, including access to artificial intelligence. And this will only be achieved if we right the historical wrongs. Otherwise, what will have happened is that we moved or drove away classical colonization in the political sense, but it still remains alive in the economic sense. And if you are economically crippled, then your political liberation only becomes flag independence, whose claim to fame is you just have black faces as presidents and as ministers, and you have national anthems, but otherwise you are still being controlled by other factors. So those arguments of reverse racism are, in my view, without merit. The reality is that the colonialists left the colonies unwillingly. The colonies were their hunting ground. If you wanted coffee and tea, you planted it in the colonies using cheap labor. If you wanted minerals, you mined it in the colonies using cheap labor. Then, when you appeared to have left after colonization, what happened in many countries? You allowed the people to elect their leaders, most of whom you had educated in your countries, most of whom you had given tastes. They became what the French appropriately called the compras de bourgeois, instruments to be used by the colonizers. So you left. They became presidents, they became ministers, they became prime ministers, but they retained you as advisors. You still borrowed, they still borrowed from your institution, the Bretton Woods institution. In their oil sectors, you controlled the oil sector. In agriculture, you controlled them. You still mined their uranium, their copper, their coltan, their everything almost for free. And a new generation of Africans are coming and are saying, no, we were shortchanged. We thought we had the real deal, but it was a raw deal. And the young people in the Sahel region, for example, in Niger, in Mali, and Burkina Faso are saying, we are now going to bring back the real deal. We are going to take charge of our agriculture. We are going to take charge of our mines. We are going to take charge of our politics. We are going to take charge of our culture. And in this way, when we exploit, we'll engage with the rest of the world, we'll sell these items and improve the quality of the lives of our people. Of course, when that happens, the former colonizers are now asking, so some of them have actually woken up. They are annoyed. They are worried. Because in the long run, if this happens, the quality of life in France will change. The quality of life in most of Europe will change. Because the things they used to get for free are no longer free. And that is why you can see France now frantically trying to do things to undermine the administrations in the Sahel region. That is why you see France trying to get new clients. These clients which were not their former colonies. That is why you see them going out of their way to entice everyone. And it's not only France. All the former colonizers are busy. There is a new scramble for Africa. And it comes in the form of loans, it comes in the forms of bilateral arrangements, it comes in the form of private, public sector arrangements, and it comes in all these guises, but the agenda and the DNA remains one and the same: to control the continent of Africa in the same way that they controlled it after Berlin in 1884. The beauty is that there is now a critical mass of Africans at all levels who are saying not again, not again. And they are saying this because they have looked at other parts of the world which were colonized and who have successfully said not again. The Indians have said not again, and you can see where they are going. The Chinese have said not again, and you can see where they are going. The Thai have said not again. The Vietnamese have said not again. And Africans are also saying not again. We were once beaten, we will not be beaten again. And this is making the European powers very angry. Very angry. They will not stop. They'll try to use every means available in their arsenal to torpedo what is happening in the continent of Africa. And this time round, I don't think they are going to succeed. When one talks about the neo-colonial project and one talks about the role of France in particular, and in particular in the Sahel, this is the context in which it ought to be understood. When the coups took place initially in that part, in Mali, in Niger, and in Burkina, and ECOWAS threatened these administrations, particularly Niger, which came later. They said we must restore order because the African Union does not want unconstitutional change of powers. ECOWAS does not want unconstitutional change of powers, and they were ostracized from the African Union. They cannot participate in the activities of the African Union. They cannot participate in the activities of ECOWAS. And ultimately, the three countries of the Sahel moved out of ECOWAS and have now formed their own union. But remember that what then happened is that the French did vow that they are not going to allow that for a number of reasons, most of them economic, because they no longer have access to their cheap minerals such as uranium. And insurgency has been one of the things that is used as a way of fighting this proxy war, because the colonialist does not sometimes come directly. They use your very own to ensure that they undermine what you are doing. And that is why in northern Mali, in northern Niger, in northern Burkina Faso, the insurgents are alive and well. And you've seen the hostility of some of the countries in that region, particularly the administration in La Côte d'Ivoire has been very hostile. Activities have also been perpetrated from Algeria, and much more recently, the very blatant attack at the airport in Niamey, and in Niger, in Niamey, and the recent attempt at the blockade of fuel to Bamako in Mali. So when you hear the military administration in Niger coming out and saying, we know who we are fighting, it is not these insurgents. This is France. And they are doing this with a view to ensuring that they eliminate our administration and we go back to where we were before. So this is a declaration of war and telling the world that we now know who our enemies are. We are not going to focus on the enmity. We have seen, or rather, we are not going to focus on the proxies. We have seen the dog back, and we now know who owns the dog. And that dog is owned by France. And I think it is a declaration that is appropriate. The French may want to hide, as they have been hiding all this while, but I think it is now the duty of African countries to recognize from the region in ECOWAS, from the African Union, and this is a matter that I believe ought to be discussed at the AU summit in Addis Ababa, so that France is not allowed to once again use power and force to torpedo and to undermine administrations which are popular. And let's talk about popularity. Some of the people who talk against this administration, particularly the African Union, say that these were unconstitutional changes of power. Unconstitutional in the sense that these leaders were not elected. But what the leaders are saying from the military is that the politicians who work at the behest of these colonial powers have perfected the art of manipulating the ballot box. And they are aided in this regard by these powers. We can no longer trust the ballot box. We have come in using extraordinary means, which is the military, because we love our countries. We are creating transitional arrangements so that the people can begin to think of how to change powers. And some of us have suggested in some of these situations that is the duty of these transitional governments to have an all-people's conference in their countries and then agree on how they are going to midwife new methods of governance which will be people-friendly and which will not be susceptible to manipulation by neo-colonial powers such as France and the United Kingdom. You know, when we agree that land is the last colonial question, we must be careful that in taking away the land from the white colonizers and neo-colonizers, the land does not fall in the hands of black neo-colonizers, because that has happened in a number of countries. Laws must be put in place to ensure that not any single individual or groups of individuals simply replace the white colonizers. And this is why fair distribution of this land must be undertaken. And it must be undertaken not in a naive way, because you also don't want to seize land and use it in a manner that undermines productivity and agriculture. This is how cooperatives come in. This is how you organize communities to own large tracts of land by them buying shares in companies and then having those parcels of land tilled in a manner that is in keeping with modern technology. It can be done. The Zimbabweans can borrow the cooperative method that was used to some good effect in countries such as Kenya. The South Africans can do so. Because what we have realized, not only in Zimbabwe and in South Africa, but in countries such as Kenya, where land was seized from the whites, it ended up in the hands of politicians and senior civil servants who literally replaced the white colonizers. That mistake must not be repeated. We must ensure that the distribution is fair, that the distribution is done in a manner that ensures that agriculture and productivity is not compromised, that that particular process of distribution is done in a manner that does not expose any group of individuals who are decidedly Zimbabweans or South Africans to poverty, and that must be done in a manner that is colorblind, as long as everybody agrees to be good citizens of those countries. Otherwise, we will be replacing one set of thieves with another set of thieves. When one talks about land, one can wish that there were simpler solutions. One can wish that we were slicing a piece of bread, a loaf of bread. It is neater when you are slicing a loaf of bread. You can even make the slices more or less equal. But land is the culmination of emotions, individual emotions, communal emotions, historical emotions, And any solution that deals with the question of land will always be nuanced. It will always be complicated. But as long as the underlying philosophy is a philosophy of fairness, then 9 out of 10, if we score 1 out of 10, if we score 7, that is not too bad, knowing that the battle is intergenerational. It will be fought from generation to generation.